we know that we do get quite a bit of energy from fat at rest. You know, we've already talked about you probably are burning 60% of your calories from fat. If you're eating a mixed diet at rest, you're just sitting around. But as you start to exercise, you know, we can actually measure this. And so energy expenditure and fuel utilization during running can be measured, and exercise can be measured with something called a metabolic cart. And what we see is that as exercise intensity increases, then we move from using fat and carbohydrate for fuel to only using carbohydrate, right? Because we've talked about this with the energy systems. We start to use, instead of that aerobic system primarily being used for fueling the body, then we end up shifting to more glycolytic, which, and what happens there is the glycolytic system, you're just using primarily carbohydrate if you're exercising very intensely. But if you're just going for a 3 mile jog, you're going to be using carbohydrate and fat. And we do this, and this is in this section, looking at something called the respiratory exchange ratio. If you've been in the lab, you've seen these numbers. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but you can measure your gas exchange through this indirect calorimeter, or metabolic cart as we call it. And if you get a number, the RER of 0.7, that means you're burning 100% fat. And if you get an RER of 1.0 or even greater, that means you're burning 100% carbohydrate. And we've looked at a little bit, if you've paid attention to chapter 3 in some of the videos, I've shown you what metabolic reports look like and what some of those numbers can look like. If you want to go back and check that out, you can. But this has to do with the fact that when you look at a glucose, it has 6 carbons. And if you look at a fat, it's got like 12, 14, 16 carbons. So it takes more oxygen to combine with that carbon to get it to CO2, and that's where these the ratios are coming from. But I won't ask you that for a test. Just know that when you see these numbers, the lower means you're burning more fat, and the higher, closer to 1, means you're burning more carbohydrate. And this is in your book, and it shows you what happens when you go from rest and you are, so someone's running, they start at a 7.5 minute per mile pace, and then they increase the speed, right, to 8 minute per mile pace. So even though you're running faster because your time is going down, you see that from 9.5 to 8 minute per mile pace. And what you also will see here is that heart rate increases. You know, if you're at rest, the average heart rate's about 72 beats a minute. And then the RER is 0.77. That means you're burning a lot of fat. And the metabolic cart will give you this. Back in the day, we used to have to calculate this. So this is telling you, okay, yeah, this individual is burning 78% of his calories from fat and 22% from carbohydrate. But what you're going to see, and then let me go ahead and go through 1.4 calories a minute. And then you get into, 1.1 calories from fat and 0.3 from carbohydrate. If you do the math on this, because they're only burning 1.4 calories a minute, right? So the majority of that's coming from fat. But then as you start to increase intensity, and we'll go all the way down here, you go from a heart rate of 127 up to 150 and an RER of 0.88 up to 0.92. And what this does is this shows you that, hey, okay, now you're starting to burn even at this lower intensity, right, at 9.5 minute per mile pace running, you're already burning more carbohydrate than you are fat. And then as you get to that 8 minute per mile pace, then you're actually burning, it's flipped from here at rest, and you're burning almost 73% from carbohydrate. So just know that the lower intensities, you're going to be able to burn more fat, use more oxygen. But as intensity increases, then you're going to be shifting to more carbohydrate use because it's quicker, right? It's quicker to break down. Fat takes longer, right? Because you have to go through all those processes. But the most important thing here too is to look at, you went from 1.4 calories at rest, and that's the scary thing, right? We don't burn that many calories at rest, all the way up to when they run it at 9.5 minute per mile pace. That's 11.5 calories a minute, all the way up to 15. And I've seen people burn 20 calories a minute, but just know that this is during a maximal. If you know the really high calorie burns are going to be during near maximal exercise. And so this is what it looks like. This is as a percentage, just to describe visually what we just said, is that as you increase your intensity, what happens is the carbohydrate utilization increases and the fat utilization decreases. We just don't have the time to burn that fat. And then what happens if you exercise for a prolonged period of time? This is interesting too. What tends to happen is that fat will, because let's say we get on a treadmill at 6 miles an hour and we run for 2 hours, what's going to happen? Well, over time, at the same pace, as your carbohydrate stores become depleted, you're going to start to use more fat and your body just shifts. And this has to do with hormones and really more of the adrenaline hormones, epinephrine, norepinephrine in particular, over time will continue to increase. And this causes the increased use of fat for fuel. But again, it's not that much. If you look at a percentage, you start at 40% fat and what is that? 62% carbohydrate, something like that. And then you're just going from here to, maybe a 10% increase, right, in fat use over 100 minutes. And so you're, again, it's and when it's extended, then you continue to see this rise, right? So that's it around fat and exercise. We'll see you in the next chapter.